So now we have entered Chapter 18 portion of the endocrine system, where we will be discussing the endocrine glands and the hormones they will secrete. So quick overview of our endocrine system and what it's in charge of. As you can see, it's a lot. So we have regulation of metabolism, control of food intake and digestion, modulation of tissue development, ion regulation, water balance, heart rate and blood pressure regulation, control of blood glucose and other nutrients, control of reproductive functions, uterine contractions and milk release, and lastly, immune system regulation. So we'll start off discussing the pituitary gland and hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus is kind of like the mother of the pituitary gland. We're going to get more into detail on what the hypothalamus does for the pituitary gland in just a moment. But right now, let's look at this pituitary gland. So if we take a look at this mid-sagittal view of the brain, we can see that this little pink guy down here is our pituitary gland. Over here, it's a little bit blown up. We will be learning some of these nervous system structures next quarter, but we can see the thalamus, and extending off of there will be the hypothalamus anteriorly. And right here at the point of that hypothalamus, you will see the stalk that brings it to the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. Now our pituitary gland, this is a more zoomed in picture here, you will find that it has two major lobes. We have a posterior lobe, and this is known as the neurohypophysis, mainly because we have more neural fibers moving through here, and it secretes neuropeptides. We also have some cells in this posterior pituitary called pituocytes. These are glial-like supporting cells, and we also, as I mentioned, have nerve fibers in here. Then if we take a look at our anterior pituitary lobe, we are going to call this your adenohypophysis. Adeno refers to having glandular-like tissue, which is what we find in this anterior pituitary gland. This lobe is going to produce 9 major hormones, and we will discuss them shortly. So this figure here is going to discuss how stimuli from our nervous system travels from our hypothalamus down to our pituitary gland and over to the target tissues. So let's take a look at the number one over here. You can see these neurons here that are either releasing hormones, which kind of means we are going to stimulate another hormone to be released, or it can release inhibiting hormones, which would stop the release of certain hormones. So our releasing hormones, which are represented by these green circles, will travel down through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. And we are talking about the system that is headed over to the anterior pituitary gland. We will have another system or tract in place for our posterior pituitary gland. So that brings these hormones, whether it's releasing or inhibiting, over to our anterior pituitary gland. As it's traveling through the capillaries here, we will stimulate the glandular tissue to either secrete a specific hormone or inhibit secretion of a hormone. So then after it travels through this capillary system in the anterior pituitary gland, it moves through the vein, leaving the pituitary gland over to our target tissues. Now let's talk about that anterior lobe just a little bit more. It originates from an outpocketing of the oral mucosa when we are a fetus. And like we said, this portion right in here is a part of the hypophyseal portal system. So you will see that it will have a primary capillary plexus, then we have hypophyseal portal veins that brings it to a secondary capillary plexus that will then move all of the hormones that we need in here for it to travel out of the vein and to its target tissue. It is going to have releasing and inhibiting hormones traveling from the hypothalamus over to the anterior pituitary gland in order to regulate this hormone secretion. So now let's go through the anterior pituitary hormones. We have the growth hormone, or GH, thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, or thyrotropin. We also have the adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, also known as MSH. We have some beta endorphins, lipotropins, luteinizing hormone, or LH, follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and lastly, prolactin, abbreviated PRL. To discuss these hormones further, all of these hormones are going to be proteins, and all of these hormones, except for the growth hormone, are going to activate cyclic AMP, that second messenger. So just as a review, here's our hormone attaching to our membrane-bound receptor. Remember that that is going to trigger adenylate cyclase, that is not pictured here. That will change ATP over to cyclic AMP to cause the enzyme cascade. Some of these hormones, such as TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH, are all tropic hormones. So what are tropic hormones? They are hormones that have other endocrine glands as their target. So more on that in just a little bit. But I wanted to also give you a little schematic here of how these hormones work, since we know a little bit about the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland now. So our hypothalamus would secrete the thyroid-releasing hormone that travels over to the pituitary gland and tells it to release the thyroid-stimulating hormone. Now we know this is the anterior pituitary gland where it'll be released. That hormone then travels through the blood to the thyroid gland to tell it to release thyroid hormones T4 and T3, which will then go to our peripheral tissues in order to set a basal metabolic rate. Now, if we get increased amounts of T4 and T3, we should have a negative feedback loop that one goes over to our pituitary gland and tells it to decrease secretion of our TSH, and also it heads over to the hypothalamus to tell it to decrease the secretion of the thyroid releasing hormone. Now let's talk about the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, also known as the neurohypophysis. This developed from a downgrowth of the hypothalamic neural tissue. And the neural connection to the hypothalamus that we see here, this is called your hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Anytime we see that word tract from now on, we should think of a bundle of nerves. In this case, we have these nerves that allow hormones to be transferred through them over to the posterior pituitary gland. So what is very interesting about this posterior pituitary gland is that it is not a true endocrine gland. Reason being is that the hypothalamus is the one that actually synthesizes the neurohormones oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Then it travels down the axon and is stored in the posterior pituitary gland so that when it is needed, it gets secreted into the capillaries and into circulation. Here is a great figure that shows you the travel of hormones within the posterior pituitary gland and hypothalamus. So starting here at the hypothalamus, we can see that we have these nuclei that belong to neurons that will send action potentials down their axons, over to their axon terminals where the oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone is stored. That'll be released into the capillary, which will travel out the vein and over to your target tissues. Now keep in mind that the input from our higher brain centers are going to determine whether we get stimulatory signals sent over to these neurons or inhibitory signals sent over to the neurons. And based on the frequency of those signals, we can determine whether we are going to release those hormones or keep them stored within the axon terminal. So now let's talk a little bit about oxytocin. If we look at this figure on the right side here, we are going to discuss oxytocin in relation to contractions during childbirth. The other thing it also assists with is triggers of milk ejection, also known as the letdown reflex in women producing milk. And it does play a role in sexual arousal and orgasm in males and females. So back to our figure over here. We have our hypothalamic neuron within the hypothalamus. We will get a signal from the uterus that travels over to our hypothalamus and tells it that the uterus is stretching and basically the baby's head is butt up to the cervix, and we are going to then tell the hypothalamic neuron to send an action potential down this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract over to the posterior pituitary gland where oxytocin is stored. That'll be released within the capillary that is not pictured here, and that can travel over to the uterus. That will increase the uterine contraction. Now this is going to be one of those positive feedback loops where contraction of the uterus will cause a stimulatory response of more oxytocin being released. Now if we look at the other function that it does, when the baby suckles at the nipple, it is going to stimulate the hypothalamic neuron once again. An action potential travels down and will release oxytocin into the blood, which will then travel over to the breast and allow the duct to release the milk out of the breast. Now typically when people think of breastfeeding, they think it's pretty simple, that the baby just latches on and the milk just sucks the milk out, but it doesn't work that way. We have the hormone prolactin that we'll talk about in just a moment that is in charge of creating the milk synthesization, and that stays within the ducts. Woo, don't know how that popped up. That stays within the ducts here in the breast. We need oxytocin to be released to allow that milk to move into the ducts. Other ways that the oxytocin can be secreted is by doing things like thinking of your baby, seeing a picture or video of your baby, hearing a baby cry that might make you think of your baby. So you might hear a woman complaining of their shirts being stained with milk because of their breasts leaking for that reason. Now let's talk about the antidiuretic hormone specifically. We have a specific homeostasis level of our blood osmolality. What that means is we are measuring concentration of chemical particles that are found within our blood. So when our osmolality is going to increase, we are dehydrated, and it will decrease when we are overhydrated. So when we have increased osmolality in our blood, that is going to stimulate secretion of our antidiuretic hormone, which will cause increased water reabsorption, meaning we will have more concentrated urine and less concentrated blood plasma, typically resulting in an increase in blood volume. So let's take a look at what's taking place in this diagram. we have our stimulus, which is showing us that we have a tilt within our homeostasis level here, and we get an increase in blood osmolality or osmolarity. That goes over to the hypothalamus, where we have osmoreceptors that will trigger the release of ADH. That will send the signal down the neurons into the posterior pituitary gland and release ADH from the axon terminals there. It'll go into blood circulation and travel over to the kidney, where we have the functional unit of the kidney, the nephron, and specifically at the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, it will synthesize aquaporins. Aquaporins are channels that allow water to leave these tubules and become reabsorbed back into the blood. This will help prevent any further increases in blood osmolarity. Now, if we go back up here, these osmoreceptors in our hypothalamus are also going to trigger thirst. When we are thirsty, we will drink more water, hopefully, and that will reduce the blood osmolality to our set point. Now, what happens if our solute concentration within our blood is low? An example of this would be when we are overhydrated. So at this point, ADH will not be released. Within our hypothalamus, we would have inhibitory signaling, and so that would not cause a release of ADH from the posterior pituitary gland. Without that release, those aquaporins will not be synthesized here in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, and water stays within these tubules of the kidney and will get excreted as urine. This happens when we drink alcohol as well. Alcohol inhibits ADH release that will cause this copious urine output. So this always reminds me of when I was teaching a biology course one summer. A student raised his hand and asked me if breaking the seal was true. And I did not know what this phrase meant until I came home and I asked my husband what it meant. After he explained it to me, I soon realized that this breaking the seal is a myth. When you are at a bar and you have been, let's say, drinking beers and you get to your second or third beer, you really have to go to the bathroom. Reason being is because at that point in time, your body has had the time frame to have the hypothalamus signal to your posterior pituitary gland to inhibit the ADH. So it's no longer releasing it, causing the water to stay within your tubules and be excreted as urine. And so your bladder is filling with more and more water, and at a certain point, you're going to have to go to the bathroom and release that urine. And so after you do that, that ADH is still being inhibited. And so you will continually have to urinate until that alcohol leaves your system. Now let's talk about the growth hormone. The growth hormone is produced by cells called your somatotrophs. They will stimulate most cells within our body, but the target cells are specifically bone and skeletal muscle. They will also promote cartilage growth. And so in this figure, we can see that your pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary gland, would secrete that growth hormone that would go over to your muscles. We would also get a signal sent over to your liver, and it'll stimulate this IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, that will then go over and stimulate bone growth. Other things we see is stimulation of the uptake of amino acids, which will, through anabolism, promote protein synthesis, and it'll encourage us to utilize our fats for fuel rather than glucose. It can also stimulate the synthesis of glycogen. I was explaining this or discussing this with one of the students in our class, is that there are many different forms of the growth hormone. We have just hit the tip of the iceberg of what we know about growth hormones. And so some of these functions may be a little contradictory. And the reason is because we are giving a summary of all of the functions that the growth hormone is responsible for. So one of the types of growth hormones is responsible for stimulating synthesis of glycogen. So how do we get growth hormone released or inhibited from the anterior pituitary gland? Our hypothalamus will either secrete a growth hormone releasing hormone, which would then cause the pituitary gland to release the growth hormone, or it can release a growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also known as somatostatin, and that would stop the pituitary gland from releasing the growth hormone. Now let's move into our thyroid-stimulating hormone, also known as TSH or thyrotropin. This is going to be produced by thyrotrophs of our anterior pituitary gland, and it stimulates normal development and secretory functioning of our thyroid gland. The thyroid gland in turn will release thyroid hormones, one of them being T4 or thyroxine, and the other being T3. So this is a nice little schematic that discusses the release of our thyroid-stimulating hormone. In our hypothalamus, we are going to release the thyroid or thyrotropin releasing hormone, and that will signal to our anterior pituitary gland to release the thyroid-stimulating hormone. That goes to our thyroid gland, tells it to release the thyroid hormones. That goes to the target cells. Now, all of this that we just described is going to stimulate the functions of the thyroid hormones, whereas if we see that our concentration of thyroid hormones are increasing, we can, through our negative feedback loop, go over to the anterior pituitary gland and hypothalamus, telling them to stop secreting their corresponding hormones. Now let's discuss the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, also known as corticotropin. This is secreted by corticotrophs of our anterior pituitary gland. That is going to travel over to our adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidney here and tell it to release corticosteroids, one of them being cortisol. How can we control ACTH release of the anterior pituitary gland? We are going to have the hypothalamus release a hormone known as the corticotropin releasing factor. And then that goes over to the anterior pituitary gland and releases the ACTH. We have internal and external factors such as fever or hypoglycemia and stressors that can alter the release of this corticotropin releasing factor or hormone. The other thing I want to mention real quick is that our adrenal cortex stimulates secretion of corticosteroids. There are going to be two classes here. We have our glucocorticoids, which would include cortisol, and we also have our mineralocorticoids, which includes aldosterone. And of course, if we have these in increased levels, we can stop their secretion through our negative feedback loop by talking to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland. Now for the other hormones that we mentioned secreted from the anterior pituitary gland, we have ACTH, MSH, which is our melanocyte stimulating hormone, endorphins, and lipotropins. They are all going to be derived from the same large precursor molecule, when it's stimulated by CRH. What these hormones are responsible for will be different. So our melanocyte stimulating hormone will cause the melanocytes within our skin to produce more melanin. Our endorphins, which you may have heard of being released during exercise, can serve as an analgesic and will be produced during times of stress, like exercising. And our lipotropins are going to cause our adipocytes to catabolize fat. Now let's talk about our gonadotropins. There is going to be 2 of them secreted from our anterior pituitary gland, and we will go into a lot more detail once we discuss the reproductive system next quarter. So we have our follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH, and both of these will be secreted within males and females. They are secreted specifically by the gonadotropes that we find in the anterior pituitary gland. FSH is going to stimulate gamete production. So this means it will head over to the ovary in a female and assist in the growth and production of the egg, whereas in a male, it will travel over to the testes and contribute to the production of sperm. Our luteinizing hormone, or LH, will promote the production of gonadal hormones. So in the female, it will tell the ovary to secrete estrogen and progesterone, and in the male, it will travel to the testes and tell it to secrete testosterone. And all of these hormones are needed for gamete production, so they work hand in hand, these 2 hormones. We will not see FSH or LH secreted in the blood until boys and girls reach puberty. How are we going to regulate our gonadotropins? We will have from the hypothalamus the gonadotropin releasing hormone during or after puberty that will travel to the anterior pituitary gland and release FSH and LH. That in this image is showing it traveling over to the testes, so this is a male, and the FSH will develop the sperm cells and the LH will develop testosterone. Do not worry what Sertoli and Leydig cells are. That will be covered next quarter. And if we see increased levels of these hormones, then we, through the negative feedback loop, will tell the hypothalamus to stop secreting the releasing hormone and the anterior pituitary gland to stop secreting FSH and LH. Lastly, let's talk about prolactin. This is secreted in the anterior pituitary gland by the lactotrophs, and its function is to stimulate milk production. So how do we regulate prolactin? We know that lactating women typically after pregnancy will be the ones producing milk. But how come we don't always produce milk? How come males don't produce milk? This is because our hypothalamus is secreting something known as the prolactin inhibiting hormone, also known as dopamine. During the end of pregnancy, the blood levels of prolactin would start to rise. This is in preparation to breastfeed the baby when it is born. And at that point, the prolactin releasing hormone would be secreted from the hypothalamus so that milk production would be put into place. When an infant suckles at the breast, it stimulates this prolactin releasing hormone to be released. And that will promote even more milk production. So if a woman is concerned that she has low milk supply, then she should have her infant at her breast more often so that the suckling will stimulate more prolactin secretion. here's a figure that reminds us how oxytocin is at play here too. The infant over at number 1, we obviously don't see the infant in the picture, but they suckle at the breast. That sends information through the sensory nerve endings over to our neural pathways to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then is going to produce oxytocin that will be released by the posterior pituitary gland. That goes over to our mammary ducts and lobules. It contracts them and allows the milk to be let down and out through the nipple.